Let's talk about while loops. So while loops are just another way in C# to be able to perform the looping operation. One natural question that might arise is, what is the difference between a for loop and a while loop? And that's a great question to ask. So when we were working with for loops, you've noticed that we had a pretty clear lower and upper bounds. We started from somewhere and then we ended up somewhere else. The steps analogy, right? So let's say you start from 1, end up at 5, or whatever your upper bound may be. You might be incrementing or decrementing. However, there might be situations in which you don't know how many times you need to loop. And in that case, you can use a while loop. While loop gives you more flexibility. You can loop 10 times or 5 times or a million times, depending on the condition. So in a while loop, there's a Boolean expression that will evaluate to a Boolean value. And if that Boolean value happens to be true, then you will continue on looping. Otherwise, you will stop the loop. And that could be 5 times, 10 times, or as many times as you want it to be. So let me go ahead and show you this in an example. I will say var input, so I will declare a variable, and I will get an input from a user. And you already know how to do that. So I will say console, read line. Then I will say I want to print this to the console, whatever the user entered. I will say user input is input. Nothing complicated. User gives us an input, we just show it right back to them. That's all. Then we decide, you know what? Let's go ahead and keep doing this until the user gives us no input. So if the input is like an empty string, then we will stop asking the user for an input. But up until the user keep providing us with an input, we'll keep showing it back to them. So this can happen 5 times, 10 times, or a million times. We don't know. So that's why we're going to be using a while loop. So I will say while, and then in here, very simply, I will say the same thing. We don't need to declare another input variable, obviously, because we've already declared it up here. But what we're doing is we're assigning a new value to the variable. And then we're simply printing it out again. But here's the kicker. This is where we put our condition. So we say, while this expression, while this Boolean expression evaluates down to a true, which is a Boolean value, then keep executing this block. Otherwise, don't do it. Move on to the rest of the execution. So in here, we're trying to say, if the input from the user is not an empty string, that should be true. So as long as the input from the user is not an empty string, we execute this line. Or we execute this block, rather. So how can we say this in code? Well, you already know about the not operator, which is going to be negating a Boolean value. In this case, we'll say, okay, input equals, and then we will say string empty. String empty is basically the same thing as us saying empty string, but it's more efficient than saying string. And I won't be going into the detailed reasoning behind it because it's out of scope of this video, but just know that whenever you want to initialize a variable and initialize it as an empty string, just use string empty. Much cleaner and more efficient. Okay, so here we're saying while input is not an empty string because of this not operator, then execute this block of code. So let's go ahead and see it in action. I'll actually breakpoint it right here, breakpoint it right here, and then run the program. Now let's see. I will say hi. User input is hi. Great. And it's saying, is the given input equal to an empty string? Obviously, it's not true. And that's being negated, and the whole thing becomes true. So we actually enter and try to execute this block of code. So once again, we ask for an input. I say, hey, and it's going to print it and check if that input was empty. Now let's actually give it an empty string. See? Now it's going to print an empty string. Come here. And then empty string, in fact, equals string empty. So it is an empty string. So it is true. And true will be negated, and that will become false. So we'll actually exit out the while loop. And here you are. It exited out the while loop. And you can see here, it says user input is just nothing, and exited out, which is great. We can also see another scenario in which we, right off the bat, say nothing. So here it says an input from the user was an empty string, prints that out, and then before entering the loop, it has to check the condition. The condition in this case is that, once again, the input was empty, so it is an empty string, and that is true. We negate that, it becomes false, and then this block of code will never be executed. So you will see we will jump right to the end. Rightly so, that happened. So only once, and once meaning we've only printed it here, but the loop did not even run because the condition was not met. And that's it. That's our while loop. So once again, remember, whenever you don't know how many times you want to loop, use a while loop.